Hi everyone, Kat Messina here.
Hi, Bill Riva.
We are here today to film our podcast on the hidden curriculum found within schools. So, a hidden curriculum, according to Merfet Aish Al-Subei, author of Hidden Curriculum as one of current issue of curriculum. A hidden curriculum refers to the unspoken or implicit values, behaviors, procedures, and norms that exist in the educational setting. A hidden curriculum is found underneath that of a regular curriculum. It is teaching the students implicitly, so not outwardly, how to assimilate to the dominant culture. It focuses only on the dominant culture. And a dominant culture is that the most prevalent culture within a society that people are expected to follow the norms of.
And within the U.S., we have this very strong Western European dominant culture, which is very geared towards the white culture, and it helps those of the white culture get more and have a lot more opportunities than anyone who is of a different race or ethnicity. So, and like Kat said, the only way for someone to really get on board of these opportunities, which at the same time, once they can or do, it's not the same as a white person would. They have to assimilate into the culture and lose theirs entirely, which, is a problem for them as they don't have their culture anymore. And that kind of defines a lot of people, unfortunately.
Yes. So the hidden curriculum within the U.S. does tend to focus a lot on on the curriculum with that focuses on the white culture. As an English teacher and Billy as a history teacher, the English department in general, they tend to choose novels that only feature white protagonists.
And in a historical standpoint, we tend to only really ever talk about um, oh, the white dominant country doing these things, and usually it's only ever good things in a lower grade setting most of the time. Even in textbooks, you see that the victor is the person who writes the stories in the textbooks, but often they are leaving out very important racial histories. A lot of the time, anything that's not white is often left out.
And through these curriculums, through this teaching of only white and white protagonists, it kind of leads to an idea of ethnocentrism. And ethnocentrism is the inability to see how another culture does things as a viable way of doing things. You only see what your culture does as the only way to get things done. And if we don't teach our students to look beyond that, they are very inhibited in what they can do.
And if you tend to leave out these very important historical events that are geared towards the atrocities that the white man has done, unfortunately, you don't learn from those mistakes. You tend to just overlook it, and as a lot of historians do say, history will eventually repeat itself, and for the worse of mankind, unfortunately.
Yes, because students, especially those of a dominant culture, they need to get the cultural experience. They need to understand how other cultures work and not be as narrow-minded. And on the other hand, students that are of multicultural descent, they need to see themselves represented in the curriculum. Because then without that, they tend to feel a sense of de-individualization, and they tend to lose their identity because their culture tends to identify them. So in an English setting, we always tend to choose books with white protagonists. And a lot of times what people fail to realize is the books you read do teach you a lot about life. So when they're reading books about white protagonists, they're reading books about how white people do things. So to branch out of that, they need to start reading books from other cultural perspectives.
And so, as Kat said about the
Individualization.
yes, as she said about that, without learning about one's own history and their own culture that is said throughout the history, you tend to not be able to learn about yourself truly, and you end up losing everything your people knew beforehand, and it's just lost in time, which again just kind of ends that whole cycle, and that whole, even that idea of oral tradition is lost, or even written tradition, depending on the culture. And you don't have any more room for any more to come into that culture and keep it alive, which is always a sad thing to see when something dies, because there's several times in history when the white person came and completely wiped out a group of people, and that culture just stopped.
And you never even get the perspective of the people that the white people got rid of.
Exactly.
The problem with the hidden curriculum within history is the fact that they're only telling history from the white perspective. There's many points in history where you miss a big part of the story because you're not hearing it from both sides.
And you're 100% correct. And would you say that it's kind of like the same thing for English, where you are only really seeing the side of a white person, and you're never seeing a writing that is of someone, say, from the Middle East, they have plenty of great, amazing authors from there, but you miss out on that.
Oh, completely. Because I feel like, especially in the emotional aspect, where a reader learns a lot about emotions and how to react to things through what they read. And when you don't expand your horizons and get another cultural view, you're not really learning how other people react. Because a lot of literature is based in history, and a lot of literature is based within the culture, and the cultural setting of a book really drives how someone reacts and how the world works. So when you're only reading it from one perspective, you're missing a whole other world out there. And I think that's the case whenever you're only limiting yourself to one view.
So in high school, I remember I had to read The Kite Runner, which is both a historical and in a literal literature sense. It's a great book. It's well written. It's from a Middle Eastern author who had to leave the country, and it also goes deep into the historical effects of what happened in his home, in his hometown, and how he had to emigrate and leave. But a lot of people don't have that same opportunity to read something like that. And so it takes away from that whole experience.
On the other hand, with my high school experience, I don't remember reading any books from another cultural perspective. I'm pretty sure the only book I read from a protagonist who wasn't white was The Color Purple by Alice Walker. And that honestly ended up being my favorite book that I read in high school, and I think it was because it was refreshing to read a different perspective. But I think also because of that, I missed out on a lot of different ways to look at the world. I never really saw the oppression of Black people until I read The Color Purple, and until I got a new history teacher. Because beforehand, when all my history courses, we learned about the Civil War and we learned about the American Revolution, and we never really heard how the slaves were affected by the Civil War. We never really heard how there were Black people who fought in the American Revolution and how they were treated.
And, that goes along with a hidden curriculum where they just kind of skim over aspects that they think are important because it's not the white culture. So they just skim over that, and they talk about the only stuff that they think matters, which is anything that has to do with promoting the dominant white culture and how great it is and how fantastic it can be and it has been. And it's only about the growth of the white person, but never do you hear in the younger grades about how we enslaved millions of people and then didn't give them their freedom and even all their rights until the late 60s. And even then, there's still that issue of they're still being oppressed, even in today's time. So they skim over all these important matters that, unfortunately, you tend not to actually see. You don't actually get to learn about it until you're in the ending years of high school or even in college, which is unfortunate. And I'm sure the same way goes with literature and how a lot of people miss out on that, where most of the time you're just reading stuff from a white person like Mark Twain or even Edgar Allan Poe.
Yes.
I guess is another good example.
The literature is my department, as you can see.
That is true. It's yours.
But I think with all this talk about how it's wrong, I think now we should start talking about how to fix it. Because a lot of times with English, people go, oh, just to get more perspective in there, we can just throw in 1 or 2 books. But I think it's so much more than just throwing in one book about written in a African American perspective, or one book like The Kite Runner written in a Middle Eastern perspective. I think it's something where you have to build a unit that really does expand the horizons and the cultural the perspectives that a student will see. So you can't build a curriculum where you have 6 books written by a white person and 1 book written by an African American person. I think you have to intersperse it and say, yes, you don't have to get rid of all your white protagonists, because a lot of the time the most famous works of literature are white perspective. But there are also books like Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Are Watching God that I think students can benefit from reading. And there's also The House on Mango Street, written in that was based in Mexico, written in a Latina perspective that students can learn from as well. And I think if you intersperse books like that, like The Kite Runner, like The House on Mango Street, and like Their Eyes Are Watching God, you will give your students a lot better perspective on cultures.
Being able to intersperse these more, racially fluent books with different authors that are all African Americans or even Mexican or Latinos, adds on to the learning experience, definitely, like we've already said. But the same thing can be said with any historical context. Just being able to look at a different story or different personal, journal from someone who was a slave, you can definitely learn a lot more about that time than you can just reading some textbook that was probably written by some old white guy who probably has no idea about the sufferings of a African American who was a slave at the time. It all comes down to having that good learning environment, interspersing a lot of different racial stories that help add to the learning. And for me, when I was when I was in school growing up and I would read these books, I'd be like, all the books with white, most of them had white authors, and I mean, it's a white author, and then I didn't even realize when I would get a different author who wasn't white, because I was so in tune to just reading these books. But it wasn't until you start actually reading them that they actually are different. Stuff is different when you have a white person who's the author or a African American who's an author. Something changes within the work, so something has more spirit and more depth to it than the one that is just normal and is boring.
And I think even going beyond literature, it's when you also think of an English class, you think of grammar. And I think one story that really is sticking out in my head is a story in the REM textbook, which, for those of you that don't know what I'm talking about, it is Rethinking Multicultural Education, which are just a conglomeration of stories from teachers. And one of them that really sticks out is a teacher talks about how she teaches Ebonics. And Ebonics is how African Americans construct their grammar and their grammar rules, and it kind of shows that it doesn't have to be set in proper speech. Proper speech can mean many things. And when I was reading the story, they were saying how the African American children didn't understand why their speech wasn't proper because they were never taught that their speech was improper. And instead of shaming them for that, and instead of saying that they were wrong, she realized that they had a point. She realized that their speech is proper to them, and which created Ebonics. And I think that's another way to look at it too. You can't expect a student to know how to speak unless you teach them, and you can't expect any rules to really apply to those of another culture.
I think that's kind of similar to a historical event that happened in the early 40s when we joined the war, and we got attacked by Japan at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Everyone had this huge anti-Japanese sentiment. All the white people, anyways, mostly white people, and they all were afraid and angry at Japanese and even Japanese Americans. So what the president at the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had the idea of is, since because of this rising anti-Japanese sentiment and anger towards them, he decided to ease tensions by sending about 122,000 Japanese Americans to internment camps. Not exactly like concentration camps, but they were still, they had all their things taken away and revoked, and they were given these very small shacks to live in for until the end of the war, for most Japanese Americans. And a lot of times you pass that in history books. You don't talk about the Japanese internment. Mm-hmm. And again, that kind of relates to what Kat was saying, how you don't learn these things so you don't feel the same way.
Mm-hmm. So how can a history department fix the hidden curriculum?
Well, it's difficult only because in the younger ages you want to skip these very important issues only because it's too violent. But in some cases you can definitely, actually in most cases, you can definitely start teaching them about slavery and these sensitive topics, but you do it in a little more child-friendly way. So even starting at 4th grade, you can start talking about these important racial topics, since you need to start teaching them about this now, or else once they get to it, they're not going to really have too much thought or too much care for it. Mm-hmm. Once they start learning at a younger age, the more they're going to be sensitive to it, and the more they're going to be thinking about it. Mm-hmm. So to fix the whole situation now is to make textbooks actually truthful, mm-hmm. not just at one perspective of a white guy or a settler, which mm-hmm. is probably white, but definitely look at it at every angle if you can. And I know a lot of times you can't, depending on the subject or depending on the event, without getting extra sources as mm-hmm. you would be able to in a college setting or mm-hmm. even a high school setting. But with a textbook, it should be able to mention all these horrible things. Like when I was growing up, when we were talking about the American expansion, we didn't talk about the Trail of Teals. Mm-hmm. That's the huge forced migration of thousands of Native Americans from the homes in the eastern United States, and they had to move out west. And then again, we did the whole thing with, again, the Western expansion, which, the Manifest Destiny bit, where we forced them to move again, and then we got angry at them when they tried fighting back. That, you skip over those parts, and something you shouldn't have to skip over. And to fix it, textbooks are the things that definitely need to be fixed right now, because that's what most schools have.
And I think until those textbooks are fixed, teachers really do have to fill in the gaps.
Exactly.
And try to get their students to see both sides.
A lot of teachers don't want to take liberties like that, which is unfortunately causing a lot of problems. And for a literature standpoint, how would you think fixing it would? Well, how do you think you would fix it?
I think it's hard because a lot of times, a lot of the great books that show different perspectives are on the banned book list. So it's hard to go about that. But I think, I think I'm lucky where a literature standpoint kind of has more freedom. A lot of times we do have to fit with a certain curriculum, but we do have some wiggle room where we can choose the books that we want our students to learn. Although we can't choose all of them, we are able to give them different books that the curriculum might not include. That being said, I think another way to fix the hidden curriculum is to get the students themselves involved. If you get a student that is from a different culture in your class, I think if you really try to show them that they are welcome there and try to get their story incorporated into your class, you can definitely teach the students of a dominant culture a new perspective and also make the students of a different culture feel more accepted and included within your class.
I think the same thing could be said for the historical setting. Just letting students of a different culture speak up and say their mind about whatever subject, or even if they have their culture deeply rooted into that historical event, I think that works out for the better for everyone.
So hopefully we were able to expand your horizons and really show you the problems with hidden curriculum and give you a few ways to fix it within an English and history class. Thank you for listening to our podcast.
It's been a lot of fun.
Yes, Kat Messina signing off.
Bill Riva, also saying goodbye to everybody.